This is the Educational Triage Podcast. Welcome. We invite you to come along with us on an exploration of interviews, issues, and other exciting and relevant topics in education, especially alternative education. They say alternative education is a laboratory for mainstream education. Why? Well, join us every week and listen in as Philip Summers
Aloha.
and I, Tony Hunt, jump in feet first to discuss issues that may affect our classes, students, communities, as well as our teaching. Please subscribe if you enjoy and find relevance in what you experience here. And if you haven't left a quick review, please do. We appreciate your candor and insights so we can improve as we move forward. Now, let's see what's on board today. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Educational Triage. This is Tony. And of course, we have our fantabulous Philip with us this week.
Aloha.
And
Fantabulous.
before we get going, I want to remind everybody to subscribe. And this week, we are looking at institutions and communities, or how does education serve the communities that they are in? Does education serve their community? What's that?
About the whole principle of community, they talk about school community. When we were discussing, we we're going, what is community? I mean, it's such it can be an expansive term. How does it fit within schools? And how do schools fit within the community itself?
Right.
I guess it's
Community is a group with a shared purpose or vision. In this context, we're looking at a community that works and lives together for the betterment of the whole of the community. And you plop a school down in the center of it, and the school is not a community. You may have a community of teachers, but that's a pretty loose term from my way of thinking. Because the community, it's
pretty big. The educational community involves a lot of different interests per se. Yeah,
it really does. But when you look at a regular community, let's say that you have a small village or something like that, and everybody has a purpose, everybody has a role, and everybody works for the symbiotic workings of that community so that it can thrive and it's going to be better because you provide a service or a skill for that community, and so does somebody else, and so does somebody else. And so that's how those inner workings go. So for the purposes of today, I want to keep the idea of community as very simple. And I want to kind of keep it as to pre-turn of the century, meaning pre-1900. In fact, if we can go a bit back before the Industrial Revolution, as it were, where we had blacksmiths and we had the farmers and we had the sheep herders and we had the people with the cows and blah, blah, blah. So we're thinking very, very rustic sort of imagery of a community, a small one, a small hamlet, if you will.
Okay, I can see what you're saying. I'm thinking numbers. So a clan, perhaps.
It could be seen as a tribe, a clan, a community.
A tribe, yeah. A tribe's about 5.
A hamlet, 400. A village. And so everybody needs to serve a purpose. And so back at that time, when children were born, they would run around, they would play, but they would still have chores around the house because once they were weaned and once they could move about, then they would start to learn things, but they would play. And the play would have to do something with learning the social mores. And this is what child's play is. in the evolutionary scale, according to Dr.
Mm.
Peter Gray, is it's learning those social mores, and it's also learning it's almost a reproduction where they play mommy and daddy sometimes. Sometimes it's boss and worker. There's a whole bunch of
Oh,
stuff. I mean,
yeah.
we played Fred Flintstone, and we did the
Teacher.
Flintstones.
How many kids went, teacher, now you sit down and do this, and they handed out lessons.
Oh yeah,
I knew a lot
they
of
did
people
teacher,
did
they
that.
did
I didn't do that.
newsroom, you know, and
Yeah, there's all kinds of kids did weird things. But yeah, it was that authority kind of, as a role play. I want to be a teacher someday, and I've known it since I was X,
yeah,
that kind of thing. Yeah.
right.
I
And
imagine
so,
back then it was pretty simple, but yeah.
and I want you to keep that idea of authority into the back of your head too. But
Yeah.
so they play all these things, but eventually what they do is they figure out what they're going to do with their life and how they're going to be supportive of their spouse or
Mhm.
their family or even their community. So they're going to apprenticeship.
Yeah.
They're going to go
And they're
into an
gonna
apprenticeship
they're gonna
and
want to
learning
achieve
how
some
to read and write.
status. Yeah.
Pardon?
Yeah. They're gonna want to achieve some status, some sort of status outside the family and the reputation and the kinship. There's
Right.
status. So their role in society,
Mm-hmm.
would be their
And
status. And we're not talking about high status or low status, just generally speaking. Yeah.
right. And I think we're beyond where they go through, but maybe they still do. And maybe we still have the rite of passage with
Mhm.
in some communities. Uh, for instance, the Vision Quest kind of thing. There are
Oh, yeah,
different
yeah.
things that are performed by some of the tribes in Africa and in other places around the world where when a child becomes a teenager or when they start going into puberty, then there are certain rituals that are associated with that.
It's
And
meant to definitely change them
right.
rapidly.
But unless you had the time
Status.
and the status, you didn't
Yeah.
necessarily learn how to read and write. But if you did,
No.
it wasn't in a formal school.
Yeah, well, we're talking about back then. If you're
Right.
talking, let's go 300, 400 years ago. We got like villages. There was no need for education because only the
Wait,
aristocrats were
wait.
reading, writing, or creating art.
But education is not just reading, writing, and math.
Oh, I'm sorry, educational system per se of reading, writing, and math. Education came in the form of apprenticeships. It came in the form of internships. It came in the form of military service.
Right.
Life in general was a big way to learn it.
Right. You found
Yeah,
your
yeah,
niche. You found your niche and you attained the
yeah,
skills that would help you do that. Now,
yeah.
math may have been far more a requirement than reading and writing
Yeah, especially probably specific.
because you'd
If
be,
you were measuring things or building things, you had to know how to put them together in mathematical ways. So, yeah, I could see where mathematical knowledge is probably one of the more common ways of doing things.
well, yeah, if you ever read Ken Follett's book, Lord, I can't remember what it is. It's about the creation of the cathedral. Anyway,
Oh, yeah, there you go. That's a
it's
perfect example.
wonderful. But there were all these mathematical equations, whether they
Uh,
knew just how advanced they were with them, they weren't necessarily
mhm.
schooled in those. The Masons,
Yeah.
the
The
people
Masons
who
weren't
did all of
necessarily,
this.
yeah.
So, but, we've been able to hone a lot of that down. But then we come up to where Horace Mann becomes the social engineer
Yeah,
because
yeah,
now we have the Industrial Revolution and people are no longer seen at, and this is when people start flocking to the cities. This is when we have more urbanization. And
yeah,
so if we talk about how cities are growing by leaps and bounds now, and how the cities mock the country folk, that's nothing new. If you read Henry Fielding,
or
Tom
vice versa.
Jones,
It's actually
where they
vice
make
versa.
fun of the people out in the country and the country
Yeah,
folk make fun of the city folk.
Yeah, it's
It's
like where you aren't is where the other people are.
right. So, you have
Yeah.
this sort of opposing kind of viewpoint as far as how
Mhm.
the other half lives, in a sense.
Mhm.
But we
Yeah,
have that even more today because you have the cities sort of commandeering and trying to control the
yeah.
rest of whatever.
Well,
So,
the cities are concentrated with the population as well. So in a democratic society that votes, they don't have to try. They have a concentration of voters.
right.
Uh, and yeah, there's the levels that, we're talking about. When we first came out of like doing our human thing, we came
Mhm.
in bands, and the bands were basically Dunbar's number, maybe less, maybe 50 to 60, and then they grew a little bit into tribes, but tribes, are how much more. Tribes are like 300, 400. They have functions inside them, but um, the original way we congregated was in bands, and that was maybe 100 people. And then as you got higher into like bigger communities, there was more accordance and adherence to society's authority. But when capitalism came, it said the individual is the king. Individual endeavors should be rewarded. Individuals can own, no longer can it has to be a king or a lineage. And that's what kind of broke things into the big time, cities like New York City. If you think about what happened with just how's long has it been there? 310 years or something. It was a
I
it was a
think
campsite, and then of
no, I
course
think
inhabited by natives.
it's been a bit longer than I have the history of New
Yeah.
York.
I
I
look
have
at
a
it
book called The
now.
History of New York, and
America.
it's annotated by my great grandmother.
Shameless plug. How
And
cool.
yeah, it's not easy to come by, but
Yeah.
if you go onto Amazon or if you go into Rare Books, you can find it. Um, but the
It's if you think
annotations,
about what happened though, yeah. I mean, New York
she
is
has handwritten
exploding.
annotations throughout the book. It's not,
Oh,
if
that's
you buy the book, you're
fantastic.
not going to get it annotated by my great grandmother. So, but because my family has a long history with Long Island and New York.
Long Island. Yeah.
But
Your family has a long history. It's not that long in the history of humankind. I mean, it's the city that industry built. I mean, it was
right.
the site of the first tallest buildings reaching to the sky made of steel. And I mean, it's an
But
incredible
it
place.
used to be just woodland and farmland, and Long Island used to be sheep farmers and potatoes.
Yeah, a lot of it's just in the last 150 years. So that's what's happened to like our society. That's how people get lost. So many people around, and you're so lonely. If the system's broken down, the bands aren't around anymore. So we seek our own bands. But yeah,
Right, we seek
um,
our own groups, but our most of our
yeah,
groups aren't as humongous as an entire community
yeah.
as we're speaking of an entire town. Um,
It's
it's
hard to
nice to
become
have
a
a little, if you're
community under.
living within a group of people, I think everybody likes to
Hmm?
be able to maintain some sort of anonymity and have a little bit
Ah,
of distance from other people just for privacy.
what? Okay, that sounds to me. That sounds counterintuitive. Because I'd
Right.
say like if you make a small group of people, then you learn to trust them and become more intimate. If that group, if that small group, let's say it's a department of a company, and you know everybody on your floor or your department, and you kind of trust them, but they're part of X industries, then you kind of maybe keep them at arm's length. Is that what you're referring to?
No,
Maybe don't reveal as much
I'm
there.
just referring to my experience
Oh,
in all the
okay.
communities that I've lived in, and I'm not talking about working in. If we're talking about a corporation,
Ah,
you don't want intimacy at the office.
well, see, yeah, you're right.
At any level,
Some people
really.
would
I mean,
say
you might have a
that.
friendship, but that might be it.
Right.
But I'm talking about the community. So, for
Okay. Yeah.
example, if I were to move
Oh.
into a community of, say, 300-400 people, I
Yeah.
would know that there would be a lot of talk about the new
Hmm.
person that just moved into town. And so there is a lack of anonymity there because you probably
Hmm.
couldn't sneeze. I already lived in towns like that where you couldn't sneeze without everybody knowing everything about you. So you had to watch everything that you said because you didn't want everybody to know everything that there was about you because you don't
She
know
didn't
anything
want to
about
see that.
them.
That one thing you did wrong, I'm going to go, oh, did you see that? He does that all the
Yeah.
time.
Or did you hear what I heard?
He can't drive. Just, I
But
couldn't park once. Leave me alone.
if you're born into it, then that makes things a little bit different. Now, if
Yeah.
we're talking about
But
communities in school,
that
um,
is interesting. Yeah. Let's talk
uh,
about communities and schools.
okay, let's talk about communities in schools, and then let's talk about the school community as opposed to the community it's serving.
I like what you're saying. Yeah. Okay.
Does that make
If,
sense?
yeah. Yeah, it does. Go on.
It's like, okay, because it's sort of like having a classroom of kids surrounding a giant petri dish. Um, the community at school, their goal is supposed to be to serve the students, correct?
Mhm. That's
Okay.
exactly what I was getting. Yeah, hearing you say, yes.
Their job is to teach, instruct, and to serve the educational needs of the children so that,
They're the community that you were speaking of in that latter part of
right,
your statement. Yes.
they are
The
the
kids, the
connection.
students. Hmm.
They're the connectors between each other, but also the information that the children need in order
Hmm.
to attain and be able to serve their community or their future community in a better fashion. So, when a
Hmm.
child leaves each day, the community that served them that day should have helped them along the way to learn reading, writing, arithmetic, some science, some personal knowledge about themselves as far as, learning about, because you always say you start locally, then you build out, then you build out, then you build out until you're global. So you have immediate, then your family, and then local and community and town, city, blah. So they're learning all about themselves and the world about themselves, but they also do that through math, reading, and writing, and science. And social studies helps them understand some of the mechanics of what's happening. But have we gotten away from that? And have we gotten more into social engineering by trying to figure out just how much we can do in a classroom with that many kids, going back to Dunbar's number, so that we have a one size fits all in education? So these teachers are not necessarily considering the community outside and what those needs are and how to connect with the community, bring them in, and thereby work with the community to help them use their resources to help amplify the needs, but also the talents and the skills of the children that are necessary for them to support their own community.
Question? Yes. That would be my answer. Yes. We think we were answering it when you were talking about how, or I was trying to clarify how you would expose yourself in a small community. You said, well, yeah, but I'm talking about at work. I'm not doing that. I'm not, maybe a friend, but I'm not getting intimate or close to anybody there. And that's what happens in schools. I think, yeah, they don't anything that resembles a school. The heck with that. They're not going to open up. They're not going to get vulnerable. They're going to have a friend or two. They're going to bear through it. They're going to do what they have to do.
Are you talking about the children, or are you talking about the
The
teachers?
children, the children. I was
The
talking
children, I
about the
think,
students.
for a lot
I
of
think they read
children,
it.
school is a huge social biome.
Absolutely. But for the purpose of learning,
Mm-hmm.
it's an institution where you dare not show yourself. You try to become, if you're smart, you become the gray person. You're neither heralded or disciplined. You can cruise right on through, not much notice. If you're a bad, if you're a troublemaker, you're just awkward. You try to stay as low a profile as possible. You've seen all those kids. They're like, hey, I'm just trying to do my 3 or 4 years here and get the heck out of Dodge.
Right.
And that's what you were saying too. It's like, yeah, at work, I'm just here for the paycheck. And, that's my incentive is to be paid for this. And it isn't, to go to the team functions and go, yay team, and wear the t-shirt on Friday, that sort of thing.
My thing with working at the school was they were much younger than I am.
Co-workers or students? No. Co-workers.
Many of my co-workers, I may have taught. I could have taught.
Mm-hmm.
I could think of at least one who I very nearly taught junior English to.
Was that a problem?
I can think of several parents who I bumped into who did a double take because I taught them years before, and now they have kids and they brought them in. There was a parent who, when I saw her, she did a double take. I did a double take, and she didn't remember, but I remembered her. And whenever I would sub, she would walk into the class and she would say, "Oh no, I'm not dealing with you." And she would leave. And then she would tell them that she would make up a story. And so then she'd be mad at me again because she didn't like the fact that when she came to the class, I wouldn't let her play around. That's all it was. But anyway, there she was every single day wanting help with her kid.
Yeah, is that a problem? Was it a problem working with
that was not a problem.
Students who were co-workers?
That was not a problem.
No.
I really wanted to look at her and say, karma, right? But I decided not to.
Well, being the wise old veteran, I never said that. I'm saying, hello, how are you? And, in a way, that's just, and I'm not going to say a thing. It's like we've all changed.
But her kid was a great kid. He really was a wonderful kid.
Yeah.
So, she was just kind of needy. But what I'm saying is that the school community does not function for the betterment of the school. They have forced them into smaller communities to where there are alliances that are made. It's almost like a survivor project, right? They put them into these alliances where people work kind of with each other, but they also have, for better words, they have bitch sessions where all they do is they bemoan everything that's going on, but they're never looking for solutions. And when a solution comes up, they always try to pick it apart so they don't have to accept it.
Well, yeah.
I even have administrators who do that.
Well, that's what happens in schools when the numbers are great and they're institutionalized. They're bureaucracies, for one thing.
Right.
Schools there's such a thing called the McDonaldization, anyway, of workers. Okay, and what it is that, we take a worker and we produce this burger and we produce it the same way every time. And we instruct our workers for efficiency and profit to do it that way every time. That's how we do things. And that is transferred to everything in our society as much as it can. And it's been transferred into teaching with textbooks and PAT curriculum and testing outcomes that are tested to. It's the McDonaldization of, I can't say it. It's McDonaldizing, yeah. Anyway, the curriculum. It's making everybody do it for proficiency and profit. It's the most efficient way to do it. And not that I'm against being efficient. And I like a proficiency. These are positive aspects. But if those are my sole goals, if I can't accept that one kid's just not getting efficient quick enough, I can no longer make that burger. But the system keeps rolling burgers down the assembly line past the teachers, and they can't pay attention to the inevitable person. It's not a product. And that's kind of how it became. It's, well, we're producing graduates here. No, we're dealing with kids. We're dealing with students. We're dealing with God knows what they have in their lives. And we know they do. And no, they're not a product, and it's not efficient sometimes. Sometimes it's kind of inefficient because, half the relationship is sort of rebelling in a way. So anyway, it cheapens, I think,
But
teachers and what they do.
but last week we talked about how the buildings have become more something of containment rather than structures
Yeah.
of attainment. How much do you think that the parents play into this fast food processing of their children?
Well, I think they
Or
they
do you
play
think
into it
that
because
many of
they were
them do it
raised in it.
unwittingly?
Oh, absolutely unwittingly. And they go to work and they do the same thing. They're suffering at work. It's the system it's the system of, the economic system that we've kind of imposed on ourselves, like the shareholder, but I'm not going to get there. You talk about the shareholder. That's a one person thing, a shareholder. It makes an individual out of a profit. That's all. A shareholder is a profit. It's just disguising language, and the parents go to work and they go, well, I have to do it too, and the kids have to learn about the world, and so the kids are housed in the schools and they're efficiently taught, and if they don't comply, they're sort of like, what are we going to do with them? you know it's like,
But
well, you're a teacher, you should instinctively know what to do with them, and you should have the resources and time to do it, and that's the job we have, and we're not able to do it because they don't fit the timeline.
so are you saying then that possibly, and I'm not going to generalize, I will say some teachers, are you going to say, are too lazy to use their resources? Or do you think that maybe they are just, in a sense, burned out so that they can't be effective for some of those students that really need the extra handout? And
Yeah, I think the
so
imposing
they're not
system
there in
above.
order to
Yeah,
work with them
right.
to, in a sense, not rehabilitate, but you get the sense of what I'm saying, in order to bring them
Yeah,
up to snuff with their peers.
yeah. You can't effectively teach in a classroom of 32 kids. Now you're just managing kids. It's just not efficient when it comes to teaching. You can make it efficient when it comes to managing kids, but we don't even do that. I mean, there's ISS and there's suspensions and there's this, school to prison pipeline. We're finding all these kinds of ways to pick the overflow up and pretending that the schools aren't, not student centered, because they're not student centered. They talk about the student all the time, and everyone's just supporting the bureaucracy that is the school itself. And it has
People
nothing
are,
to do with teaching kids.
and people are, okay, the one thing that's really not being supported, in a sense, and I think maybe if that started being supported just a wee bit more, might
Mm.
be if instead of a popularity contest, if teachers were all supported. So it's not just the ones that the admin likes, the ones
Oh yeah.
who spew the vomit that the administration likes to smell and hear.
Yeah,
Um,
it instruments their curriculum,
if yeah,
the district-wide curriculum efficiently.
if
That's
all teachers were
beneficial, and I like that. But
if all
yeah,
teachers were treated equitably, and we didn't have these little snippy pots of people who just they don't really do a whole lot
Yeah,
except
well, they're not part. Yeah, they're just trying to
backstab.
get under the radar. Yeah,
Well,
they
no,
or
I think
they're
what
not
they
part of a
do is
community.
no,
That too.
they're
You know,
these are the ones that are more into an
a small
authoritarian
community.
kind of classroom. They don't
Oh,
like the teachers
the
who
power
actually
seekers. Yeah,
so
people who seek power. It's no
right,
coincidence. They
right.
don't do it out of the benefit of their heart. They do it because they want the power.
And so you have some incredible teachers who do amazing
Mm-hmm.
things with students. But then you
Mm-hmm.
have these others who just they're just not there.
So
And
the battle is between
but
this person and the
it's the
teacher, not
student's
the kid.
fault. It's the
Yeah.
student's fault, or it's the schedule's fault. It's the counselor's fault. And many times it can be the counselor's fault. Many times it is the student's fault. But how many times, and I heard this over and over again from one teacher who was vying and trying their hardest to become an administrator. So they looked at everything through an administrative lens. So, for example, when teachers wanted to be able to have the same lunch or even some planning time with people who are teaching the same thing, this teacher got up in a meeting and said, how dare they even consider that they have any kind of decision-making power for that? What gave them the idea that they should be even considered to help make that decision? And I thought, holy
Regarding the
cow,
curriculum they're going to teach to
who
the children.
are you?
She's an administrator. She's there to preserve the system, not educate the students.
Whenever people say we're doing this for the children, I ask them for examples of what they've done for children. And it's usually nothing. It's, well, I made this decision. No, that was you. That's not anything for the kids. Well, you wouldn't understand. Well, I'm sorry, but I have probably far more degrees than you do, and I have far more experience in far more fields than you do. Chances are I probably do understand it far more than you.
Well, see, that's interesting. I'm doing it for the children, but your job isn't to do anything for the children. Your job is to do things in support of me and people who do things for the children. That's your job. I'm sorry, I would not have taken your job because I wouldn't be able to work with the students if I was an administrator. Therefore, I don't want to be an administrator. But don't become an administrator and say you do it for the children. You do it for the teachers and the support, and they do it for the children.
They do not
and
do it
they're
for
not
the
that
teachers.
directly related.
They do not
They
do
don't.
it for the teachers. They do it for the power because they want the
They're
control.
supposed to do the job for us. They're supposed to trust us and help us and enable us to have everything we need to help the children. That's supposed to be their function, but it's not.
So what we have then is we have an institution that's governed by narcissism.
Well, it's because institutions are governed by narcissism. It's not anything about the people itself. It's what people do. The people that ascend to those positions want those positions, and those positions are set up in a system that's pretty messed up.
So how is the community served by that institution then?
It's not. I would say.
What value is it to the community? If not just because the parents are not having to go to court because of truancy. It feels as though the parents are locked into something not of their design.
They're not. It's not their design.
But what if, because I put this into the blog, what if we dismantled these huge institutions? What if we made them smaller? Because think of the money that could be saved.
Well,
wait. Let me get this out there. Let me get this out there.
Yeah.
You take, say, the neighborhood grade school and you turn that into a community center. You give that back to the community. Because, but what you do is you start serving students in a smaller scale where they could thrive. Sure, maybe the seed costs would be a little greater, but the overall maintenance costs would be slimmer. It's easier to service a furnace in a house than it is for a massive structure. You don't constantly have to have all the maintenance done.
I'm thinking that as far as elementary schools go,
Mm-hmm.
those could be structured so they're not very large to begin with, some of them. If they're
Mm-hmm.
really large, no, but some of them are kind of quaint. They can be community centers and places where the kids learn in certain ways, just not from like 8 to 3,
Mm-hmm.
all of them, buses, this, that. And as far as high schools go, they definitely need to be these, yeah, just they can't be that big. Now, when it comes to a high school or a middle school, they can't be what they are today. Yeah, I think
So,
you're right. I think they should be smaller sites, much smaller community sites. Yeah,
and I think, well, you could have satellites, and I think
yeah,
that would serve the community far better,
I think
because that
so.
way a small number of parents would have input on what's going on at this school. Sure, you
Mm.
might have you it's a better use of resources, in fact. So that way more students have the attention. Students could thrive, and students that don't have the resources at home would be able to catch up and to start and be able to start getting to where they need to be. And I'm just believing that with this smaller size and with the scope of everything that needs to be learned, it could be a massive, massive leap for many of these students and for many of the families. Because if you have
Yeah.
community centers where these grade schools are, where they're teaching reading and writing for some of the families, they have ELL for some of the families that need it. Maybe some of the families are
Right.
teaching cooking, maybe they're teaching sewing, maybe they're doing auto mechanics. It could be a huge, huge boon to the community where they could just thrive. But the schools never think about how do we best serve the community. It's how do we get this school and how do we pay for it and how do we get this through? So we need to campaign through the community so they'll give us the money, because the community is seen as a cash cow. And as long as they're breeding and as long as they're having babies that can come to the school, then it's a viable answer, what they have now.
It has a rich history too of building the central high school, the big building. It all fed. All the kids ended up at the one high school in town, and it was usually in the middle of town. And if you look at Portland, there's something quaint about Grant and Jeff and Roosevelt. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
they've been around for 100 years almost, if not, yeah, pretty close. I don't know. It's interesting. So they were right in the middle of their neighborhoods. Well, yeah. And so, they were the center kind of the community, but then we kept doing it. And when, suburbia blew up, we built the high school, built onto the high schools. And now they've just given up and they're building like mega high schools,
Oh,
like with huge campuses. And it's really, really mind boggling. I mean, a mile around the perimeter of the thing. It's just nuts.
they're 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 the educational equivalent to the Death Star.
Well, it's kind of that way, it sort of lumbers through space and sort of ominously. It's really easy to get lost there.
Right. So let me get back to the point too.
Yeah.
How are these serving the community? The community is an organism.
Mm-mm.
It's a place where people live. And that means that the schools, the education needs to be respectful of that space. They pretend to be because they say, look how beautiful we are. We provide
Yeah.
you with sporting events. We provide you with musical events. Sure,
This
you
big
do.
building of ours is beautiful, and they are. They are very beautiful structures. I'm very impressed with big schools.
But how are you serving the least of your community? And how are you, what are you doing? Sure, you're showing all the glitz and glamour, but you're not showing any of the dirt and the grit, because some of those kids who cannot get up there because they don't have everything that you think that a normal kid should have, they're not there. And so how are you respecting them? And are you respecting them by making sure that they get the best education that they can? Are you putting them in an appropriate program, or are you treating alternative schools as a side note where you can get rid of those students so they're not muddling up your numbers? And you can
Well,
continue on with all of these other kids.
what's the outcome? I mean, do you want to make an efficient high school, make sure every student graduates by their 12th year and we have a high standard of this and that and make high school rankings? Or do you want to understand that every human has a different path and that some kids are different than others? And it's just going to be a little bit more work, a little more resources in some kids if you have that standard, which I might say is important to have. It's important to have a standard, that's of proficiency. So when we do send kids out to the junior colleges or the world or the colleges, that they don't go, "Good God, where'd you learn to read? Did you?"
Well, they're already
Yeah,
saying that. The community
I
college is already
know.
asking that.
That's precisely why I said that. It's not my standard's always been no. I can't hand you off to the next educator unprepared. You have to be a 12th grader.
Hmm. And
You just have to.
you and I were just talking about the Ed Week map of school rankings,
Yeah, we were
and
kicking that around.
there were only 3 states that had a B. Everybody else was a C or a D. And
Mm.
those were Florida, was it Massachusetts,
And New Jersey.
and New Jersey.
Jersey. Yeah, Jersey. Everyone likes
New
to rip on Jersey, but yeah.
Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Florida. Yeah. So how do let's get away from what they're doing with the community, but how are they honoring their students?
Mm.
What is each
I'd
school
say,
doing to honor their students? Do you look at each student every day and say, you are a waste of my breath? Even
mm,
if you look at one student that way, you need to have a reassessment, I think.
I think
Sure,
so
there are
too.
times that we think that way, but then it's like, okay, well, what are some ways that I can get to this kid?
Yeah.
And then you work with it. Maybe you're not going to be able to. Maybe you have to pass that on because we can't handle every student. We can't handle every parent. And, they say that every generation of kids has become more and more complacent, that they are, in a sense, lazier and less they're less hardy, let's say. They're softer each generation. But what's funny
I just
is
don't. Yeah,
we
I don't
reward
buy
those
that.
kids to be, in a sense, softer, but the kids
Mm.
that have grit, we fight against. Instead of figure out that grit
Yeah.
is something wonderful, so how do we use it? Now that's just a thought that popped in my head, I think.
Well, because it's grit used in a way that we don't approve of. Whereas if you just notice grit and go, oh wow, that grit is grit. But if you say, well, they're gritty, but they're also this, then you deem them as a person they're not worth. You're not worth. It's not worth wasting your breath on, as you
That's
would say.
because you're trying to contain them and you're trying to be an authoritarian figure.
Yeah, you're not authoritative. You're authoritarian. You're not a go-to. You're not a mentor. You're an authority figure. Do what I say. Do it now.
Right. And I think that's where a lot of administrators get lost. And I believe that that's where, I mean, the
Yeah.
superintendent, after that fiasco that happened that got nationwide coverage, during the press conference, instead of talking about the incident and the steps that they were taking to rectify it, made it into this narcissistic, all about her kind of whinging. And it was embarrassing.
That's why
I
she makes the
don't
big bucks.
know how anybody could consider that superintendent to be a viable force for good for the students, for the families, for the community.
She might be a politician.
Do politics have a place in
Let's say that
school?
with straight face. She's a politician.
She is.
She is. She's a politician. That's what narcissistic sort of politicians. I'm not saying anybody's narcissist. I hate that because it's so easily. You're a narcissist.
No,
She
no,
could be just a jackwagon.
no. It was
However,
all about her.
she's a
She made the
politician.
whole thing about her. And then
Right.
why were they
Deflect.
filming? They weren't supposed to be filming. Oh, so it was supposed to be kept a
Oh,
secret. So now you're mad at the kids because they showcased what actually goes on.
yeah, right. They didn't have to post it.
You had more than 24 hours. You had more than 48 hours to come up with a press conference, and this is the best you can do.
Well, one of the best signs of maturity is the ability to accept things the way they are. And I
And to
would
take
say
accountability.
it's a little delusional to go, oh, why did they film it? Why were they born? I mean, you can go
They're
all the way back.
children. They're
Why even
children.
there? Yeah, they're children. And that's the thing too. They are children. Children are, oh boy, they do some pretty big adulty things, but they're still kids. Whew. Like, I'm
Mm-hmm.
amazed at how unintelligent and uninformed children are. Now, that's facetious, but it's true. We kind of go, oh, well, they're really smart. Yes, but they're 14. How much smart can you get at 14? I mean, you can read a lot
Mm-hmm.
of books, but you're not living a whole lot of life,
They may
especially
be
without hormones.
right. They may
The
be
hormones only kick
precocious,
in
but they
three,
are
4
not
years. Yeah.
developed.
No, they're not developed. Yeah, they say that men don't even hit like adulthood to 28. Sorry, ladies.
Yeah.
God. That's God's cruel joke on humanity. They have to put up with this idiots. It's true though. It's children. God's children are children, and yeah, gosh, it would be nice if they fit into little slots.
And it
If
would be
come on, everybody.
and it would be nice if we could get parents on the same path as the teachers.
Yeah, I was really lucky. I never got active uh, um, resistance from a parent. There was one, I think, just one, but we were like, well, no, we're not changing our standards. I'm sorry. I think a girl missed graduation and she didn't turn in her stuff, and that was it. And I'm sorry, the deadline's gone. Couldn't do anything if I wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
And but yeah, I was usually supported. I was actually kind of given deferment for being an authority figure.
Yeah,
That
I think.
surprised me sometimes, although I didn't. Yeah.
Well,
Okay. Well,
I
you're a teacher.
think
You're
where we
you're really
were,
smart. Okay.
I believe that where you and I both taught, I think that by virtue of our position,
Mm.
we were given a great deal of autonomy. But
We
then,
were.
but then we had administrators who didn't understand anything, although everybody said that they did. They really didn't. And they needed to micromanage. And so they were bent on
Yes.
destroying without and I'm not going to give them the benefit of saying that they knew what they were doing. I'm going to say that they weren't bright enough to understand what they were doing. They just didn't know. And
I agree.
And otherwise I'd be disingenuous, and I have to give them some credit. But they should have known. But getting back to everything, I think that regenerating education and getting it back to a community concept, getting it out of the hands of these, I don't know how else to call it, but it's almost like a monopoly, and putting it back in the hands of the people that it's supposed to be for would make all the difference in the world.
I just thought of something, a little image. Give me an image. Any high school, or a school for that matter, that requires a center shared left turn lane to get into, it's too big. And if it needs a light, it's way too big. If you need a light to get in and out of your high school or your junior high or elementary, it's just too big a building.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Definitely.
just
They're all
saying.
over the place. I have so many
they
of those
are.
around me.
Yeah, you do. They're long. You drive along about a half a mile, 3/4 of a mile, and you're still on the campus there to the right or left of the road.
Definitely.
It's crazy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's a
So,
lot of land, a lot of buildings. Yeah.
so we're going to wrap up.
All right.
And I want to encourage everybody to take a look at the blog post. And also, if you haven't yet, take a look at last week's episode with Dunbar's Number with Philip. And next week, Philip, we'll be talking about testing, correct?
We're going to be talking about what are tests. Just sort of like, what are these? What are the types of tests?
Yeah, let's look at testing. What is it really testing? And is it really a viable measurement?
Yeah, or if some of them are, which ones are?
And which ones would work best for our students in alternative ed? And why do people accept such a binary kind of system? Or is it a binary system?
Not according to me when it comes to testing and assessment, but that's maybe a different topic, assessment. But
probably.
We could talk about that too. Definitely have my thoughts on how do you assess learning. It's
definitely. Okay. Okay. So until then, thank you, Philip.
Thank you.
And to everybody out there, make sure you subscribe and have a wonderful week. We will see you then. Bye-bye.